From Great Depression to Superpower. How WWII saved America. The Golden Hose, how the arsenal of democracy bought the world. The year was 1940, and the sky over London was choked with smoke. The Blitz was in full fury, turning ancient stone and brick into rubble. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with a mixture of horror and calculation. To the average American, the war in Europe was a tragedy, but one that should remain on foreign soil. However, in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., a different game was being played. This is not just a story about tanks and airplanes. It is a story about gold, debt, and the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. At the onset of the conflict, the British Empire was still technically the wealthiest power on Earth. The Union Jack flew over a quarter of the globe. But modern warfare is an insatiable beast, consuming resources at a rate that no treasury can sustain forever. Britain was fighting for its life, and it needed steel, fuel, and explosives. Initially, the United States operated under a policy known as cash and carry. If Britain wanted weapons, they had to pay for them in cash and transport them on their own ships. There was no credit, no charity. By late 1940, the British Treasury was bleeding out. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man of indomitable spirit but dwindling resources, sent a desperate message to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The message was clear. Britain was broke. The cash was gone. Without American supplies, the island nation would fall to the Nazi war machine, and the light of democracy in Europe would be extinguished. Roosevelt faced a dilemma. The American public was staunchly isolationist. They remembered the unpaid debts of World War I and had no desire to finance another European slaughter. Yet, Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, the United States would be next. He needed a way to supply the British without technically violating the Neutrality Acts or angering the American taxpayer who refused to give away money for free. His solution was a stroke of political genius, introduced to the press with a folksy analogy that masked the complex geopolitical maneuvering underneath. Roosevelt told a story about a neighbor whose house was on fire. If your neighbor came to you asking for a garden hose, you would not haggle over the price of the hose. You would lend it to him to put out the fire, and when the fire was out, he would simply return the hose. This was the public face of the Lend-Lease Act, formerly known as H.R. 1776, a number chosen to evoke the spirit of American independence. Passed in March 1941, it authorized the president to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of any defense article to any government whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. But in reality, a tank is not a garden hose. A tank gets blown up, a plane crashes, fuel is burned, bullets are fired. They cannot be returned. The Lend-Lease concept was a brilliant fiction designed to bypass the ban on loans. And contrary to the garden hose story, this aid came with a heavy price tag, one that would alter the global economic landscape for a century. Before the Lend-Lease spigot was fully opened, the United States ensured that Britain paid with everything it had. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, the largest movement of physical wealth in history took place. British battleships, under the cover of darkness and high secrecy, loaded the vast majority of the Bank of England's gold reserves and sailed across the dangerous, U-boat-infested Atlantic to Canada and the United States. Billions of dollars in gold bullion were transferred to North American vaults. Before the U.S. became the arsenal of democracy for free, it had effectively drained the British savings account. Furthermore, the U.S. demanded that Britain liquidate its overseas investments. British-owned companies in the Americas were sold off at fire sale prices to American investors. The message from Washington was subtle but firm. We will help you survive, but you will no longer be our economic rival. The torch of global financial dominance was being forcibly passed. Once the deal was signed, the American industrial machine roared to life. This was the awakening of a sleeping giant. Across Detroit, Pittsburgh, and California, factories that had been idled by the Great Depression suddenly began running 24 hours a day. The scale of production was something the world had never seen and has rarely seen since. The United States did not just send weapons. They sent an entire civilization in crates. They sent over 400,000 jeeps and trucks to the Soviet Union alone. It is often said that while the Red Army shed the blood to beat the Wehrmacht, they rode to Berlin in American Studebaker trucks. They ate American canned food, specifically Spam and Tushonka, which kept the Soviet soldiers from starving during the brutal winters on the Eastern Front. Stalin, a man not known for giving compliments, famously admitted at the Tehran Conference that without American machines, the United Nations could never have won the war. The logistics of Lend-Lease were a nightmare of epic proportions. To get supplies to the Soviet Union, convoys had to brave the Arctic route to Murmansk, sailing through freezing waters while being hunted by German submarines and aircraft. Sailors died by the thousands in these icy waters to deliver aluminum, copper, and aviation fuel to a communist regime that was ideologically opposed to the United States. It was a marriage of convenience, funded by American industry. To Britain, the U.S. sent destroyers, aircraft, and raw materials. But the aid went further. It went to China to fight the Japanese, to the Free French, and to resistance movements. By the end of the war, the United States had shipped approximately $50 billion worth of supplies. In today's currency, that figure would be in the trillions. However, the Lend-Lease aspect meant that legally, these were loans or leases. While the equipment destroyed in combat was generally written off, the equipment that survived technically belonged to the United States. This led to bizarre post-war situations. In some theaters, perfectly good airplanes and trucks were pushed off aircraft carriers or bulldozed into pits and destroyed because it was too expensive to bring them back, and the recipient nations could not pay for them. The true impact of Lend-Lease, however, was found in what happened to the global economy. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the landscape of power had been completely rewritten. Great Britain, once the creditor to the world, was drowning in debt. It owed immense sums to the United States. The British Empire effectively ended not just because of the independence movements, but because London could no longer afford to maintain it. They had mortgaged their future to defeat Hitler. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States emerged not only with its homeland untouched by bombs, but with an industrial base that had doubled in size. The gold that had flowed from Europe to pay for the initial cash and carry phase, and the economic leverage gained during Lend-Lease, meant that the majority of the world's gold reserves were now sitting in the United States, specifically in the bullion depository at Fort Knox. This concentration of gold allowed the United States to dictate the terms of the post-war economic order. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the U.S. dollar was established as the world's reserve currency, backed by that massive stockpile of gold. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar. The British pound, which had reigned supreme for a century, was demoted. Lend-Lease had been the mechanism that financed the victory against fascism, but it was also the mechanism that financed the rise of the American superpower. The debt repayment dragged on for decades, a lingering shadow of the war. The United Kingdom only made its final Lend-Lease repayment to the United States and Canada on December 29, 2006. For 60 years, the British economy carried the weight of the war, sending checks across the ocean to pay for the tanks and food that had saved them from invasion. The Soviet Union, conversely, took a different approach. After the war, as the Iron Curtain fell and the Cold War began, Stalin refused to pay the debt, arguing that the Soviet Union had paid in blood. The millions of Soviet lives lost, he argued, were payment enough. This refusal became a major point of contention and froze relations between the two superpowers. It was not until decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russia agreed to pay a fraction of the original debt to normalize trade relations. There is also a psychological aspect to Lend-Lease that is often overlooked. It created a sense of dependency and expectation. It taught the world that when a crisis hits, looking to Washington for aid is the standard response. It established the paradigm of the United States as the global guarantor of security. This has burdened American foreign policy ever since, creating a dynamic where the U.S. is expected to intervene, supply, and fund conflicts around the globe. The narrative of World War II is often painted in black and white, good versus evil. But the gray area of economics tells a more nuanced story. Lend-Lease was an act of incredible generosity, but it was also an act of calculated self-interest. Roosevelt knew that fighting a war with American money and machines was preferable to fighting it with American men on the front lines, at least initially. He also knew that by arming the world, he was making the world dependent on American industry. The factories that were built to fulfill Lend-Lease contracts did not disappear in 1945. They pivoted to producing cars, refrigerators, and washing machines, fueling the great American economic boom of the 1950s. The logistical networks developed to ship tanks to Russia were repurposed for global trade. The scientific advancements funded by the war effort laid the groundwork for the technology sector. In retrospect, the Lend-Lease Act was the pivot point of the 20th century. It was the moment when the scepter of power crossed the ocean. It proved that in modern warfare, industrial capacity and economic depth are just as important as courage and tactical brilliance. Britain had the courage. America had the factory floor. The story of the garden hose was a comforting lie for a nervous public. The truth was that the United States bought the title of Superpower. The price was $50 billion in supplies distributed to dozens of nations, binding them into an American-centric system that would endure long after the last Sherman tank had rusted away. When we look back at the images of World War II, at the soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy or the tanks rolling across the plains of Kursk, we must remember what made it possible. We must remember the endless convoys of Liberty ships, the roaring assembly lines of Detroit, and the gold bars sitting quietly in the dark vaults of Fort Knox. The Lend-Lease Act did not just help win a war. It built the modern world, for better or for worse, establishing a hierarchy where the dollar is king and the United States sits on the throne. It was the greatest investment in history, and the returns are still being calculated today. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video, learned something new, or simply want to see more content like this, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps the channel grow and reach more people. And if you have thoughts or ideas you'd like to share, feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.